and welcome to the Peas and Quiet podcast. On this podcast, we discuss all things gardening, including growing veggies and flowers and how to create your dream backyard alongside nature. My name is Robin. I'm an environmental scientist turned full-time flower farmer and gardener, and I'll be your host for this podcast. In today's episode, we're talking all about cool flowers, including what they are and some ideas of flowers that you can sow now to have an early spring harvest. I share a few that I'm really excited to plant in my backyard flower farm, and also just talk about when to plant different flowers and how to prep your garden beds for your blooms. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and communities. We pay our respects to elders past and present and thank them for protecting our lands, coastlines and ecosystems. I hope you enjoy today's episode. All right, welcome back to episode 3 of the Peas and Quiet podcast. We are back today to talk all about flowers. I am super excited for this topic because I am very passionate about growing flowers in the cooler months of the year, and basically anything in the cooler months of the year, because I just love autumn and winter. We don't really have a very harsh, cold season where we live, and to be honest, a lot of Australia doesn't have really harsh winters. There are certainly some areas where it is difficult to grow, but generally winters here are pretty nice overall for the majority of Australia, and particularly for places like the subtropics and tropical regions. It's a really great time to actually grow different flowers, and also temperate areas like where I'm located on the south coast of New South Wales. It's also just the perfect time of the year to get planting and get sowing some seeds. And one of the groups of plants that I have been thinking about lately is cool flowers. And this is something that we're going to talk about today in this episode. It's going to be all about cool flowers and some of the flowers that I'm going to be growing and planting now so that I can have an early or even late winter harvest of blooms. Honestly, this topic is actually quite new to me, and I only really discovered it like a year or two ago when I was looking at what I could sow and grow in early autumn, because where I used to live in the subtropics, I had a really good list of flowers that could grow over winter because it was an easier time to grow. Particularly in areas that we lived that didn't have frost, it was pretty easy to choose what I wanted to grow. I just had to make sure that I could choose a really sunny area to make sure that the plants got enough sunlight over winter. But after watching a lot of YouTube videos and just expanding my knowledge a little bit, I came across the term cool flowers, which we're going to talk about today. So cool flowers, they're also known as hardy annuals, and they usually live for about 1 year and can survive cold temperatures, hence the name cool flowers. Now, I'm going to probably talk a little bit about some perennials in this episode, but we're going to stick to mainly hardy annuals that can handle those lower temperatures. The term cool flowers, it's really grown in popularity, I feel, over the last few years, particularly from Lisa Mason-Ziegler, who wrote a book all about cool flowers. So it looks like a wonderful book. I haven't actually personally read it, but I've been told that it is a really great resource if you are new to the term and want to understand it a little bit more. I believe she goes into detail of all of the different flowers that you can grow as cool flowers, and some tips and tricks on how to actually grow them in your garden. It's definitely catered towards the Northern Hemisphere though, so if you do get the book, you'll have to switch those dates a little bit, which I think that can be a little bit confusing, particularly when some of these areas in the Northern Hemisphere, like the US, the winter temperatures are very, very different to the ones that we have here in Australia. So just keep that in mind, but I believe it is a really great book and a really great resource all about cool flowers. But you can also find information on this on, like what I did was over the years, I've watched so many YouTube videos and just read about it in other flower books that I have. And it's not really a new term. I suppose maybe the term cool flowers is, but the term hardy annuals, it's been around forever. So many people have been doing this for years and years, which is sowing seeds before the winter actually comes and overwintering your plants so that you can then get blooms in early springtime. So that's basically what cool flowers are in a nutshell, is you plant them early and you reap the rewards when springtime comes, or even late winter, because we don't really have a really harsh winter here. And then you get your blooms, and usually the plants are quite a little bit more robust and have a really good root system, and overall can be a little bit more hardy than the ones that you just plant in spring. So I should also mention that you can either plant a lot of these hardy annuals now in early autumn and in autumn to then overwinter, or you can plant a lot of these in late winter and early spring as the weather is warming up. And they've also been selected to grow in those temperatures as well. You're just not going to get as early of a harvest, but often you'll see on the seed packet that a lot of these hardy annuals that we'll talk about, they are actually recommended to plant in spring after frost. And that's just the general consensus. And for a lot of seed companies, it's easier to write that information rather than going in depth about cool flowers and which ones are actually hardy. Also, because Australia is such a big country, I say this in like every episode, but again, we do have so many different microclimates, and I find a lot of seed packets can be very misleading with the information that's on them because there are so many climates in Australia. So it's really difficult to know whether you should actually be planting something in spring, or maybe you can plant that in winter or late winter or autumn, depending on your temperatures. Some other things about cool flowers that I particularly really love and why I love to plant them is, one, they're pretty easy to grow. A lot of these, and all of these we'll talk about how to start them from seed, but a lot of them are pretty simple to grow, and they can also withstand really cold temperatures. So you don't always have to worry about adding frost cloth over unless you are in an area that gets really hard freezes, which again, all of this information that I'm going to talk about, just apply that to your climate and your own temperatures. But another reason why I really like these is because they often don't require a lot of tending to. You can just kind of plant them and forget about them for a while, particularly over winter, because plants in general just don't really grow a lot. So you're not having to constantly do like fortnightly feeding like I am currently with the zinnias and the dahlias. They're not going to be super hungry throughout their whole life in the ground. It's more making sure that there's enough nutrients in the ground when you plant them, and maybe topping that up in early spring when the flowers start to emerge, rather than just filling up buckets of worm tea and feeding your plants every fortnight, which is what I'm currently doing, and that takes a lot of work. It's also a time of the year throughout winter when weeds aren't at their peak. So just overall, it's really generally a little bit easier to garden. And particularly for my backyard flower farm that I have, it's not a very large space. Like we're on about half an acre or so, and we definitely don't grow on all of it. But maintaining the weeds in summer is a really hard thing to do. And to be honest, I just don't. Like I do not deal with the weeds a lot of the time in summer. My method, or my go-to method, is to just, when an area gets too bad, I will just tarp it or put cardboard over it and let the weeds die back, and then either dig them out or they just decompose into the soil, just because it's way too hard over summer to be consistently weeding and dealing with all of those. But in wintertime, I don't really have to worry about that too much. And the weeds that are around are quite easy to remove. They're not like big grasses or really invasive grasses. It's often pretty small weeds that I can just go about my day and do like an hour or two of weeding there to maintain the plants. And lastly, why I like them, they're also just some of my favorite flowers of all time. I get so happy when the weather starts to cool down because I can start to think of all of my favorite flowers. And we'll be talking about the list that I have today of ones that I am either growing this year or have previously grown and really enjoyed. But yes, they are just super beautiful and I just love them. They're also very scented. I find a lot of cool flowers when they do flower, which I personally really enjoy, working with flowers that actually have a scent. I find in summer I'm mainly working with dahlias and zinnias and straw flowers, and while they're absolutely beautiful and stunning, they don't really have that scent to them like some of these cool flowers do. So cool flowers, they're not like all of these summer flowers like zinnias and cosmos and dahlias that I've been talking about because they do thrive in cooler conditions. So we're going to be talking about completely different species and varieties of plants. And like I said before, they do often have a recommendation to plant in springtime, which you can also do if you can't get them in the ground now or start to sow seeds now in autumn. Although, like I said before, the benefits of planting in autumn just allows you to get earlier blooms, and it's just more time for the plant to establish a more complex root system in the ground so that they can then start flowering as soon as the time is right and as soon as we have a little bit more sunlight as springtime approaches. So, like I also said before, just apply this knowledge to your own climate and your own growing region. This is particularly important because the success of cool flowers is really going to depend on the timing and when you actually do get them in the ground. And if you're worried about timing, you can always engage in things like gardening clubs or local gardening groups in your community. Or you can start to follow a lot of flower farmers on like Instagram and Facebook. I'm not fantastic at this in terms of updates just because I find Instagram and, to be honest, all social media very challenging in terms of consistently updating and being on my phone. I have a love-hate relationship with a lot of social media, but there are some other flower farmers who are very regular and consistent with posting, and they do kind of show like what they're doing real time in terms of what they're planting and what seeds they're sowing. So that's another great idea to get some advice for what actually to plant and grow in your local area if you have a local flower farmer. And of course, you can always ask for advice by talking to your local farmers. The best way to approach that from personal experience, because I do get quite a lot of emails and messages, which I love and I'm not complaining about, but it is definitely a little bit difficult to reply to all of them, particularly when people are asking information about their own growing climate and what I should be growing right now, how I should grow this, where I get seeds from, and all that kind of thing, which is totally fine to ask and get that kind of information. But just make sure you're approaching farmers by asking or starting out the message asking whether or not you can ask these questions, whether it's appropriate or not, and maybe thinking about either giving something in return or offering your own services in return, particularly if you want to have like a chat with them or a half an hour call. Both time and knowledge is extremely valuable, and I know quite a few farmers around here have been wanting to just chat to them, and I don't feel comfortable just asking all of these questions in a message because I know how busy they are. So yeah, it's just something to keep in mind, that maybe you may actually have to pay for people's time if you do want all of this really valuable knowledge. Or you can just keep listening to this podcast and we'll talk generally about cool flowers. I can't promise I will cover your specific climate, but we're going to continue with this conversation by chatting about when to plant certain blooms. Like I mentioned earlier, you can either plant in autumn or late winter or early spring. Autumn planting obviously means earlier blooms, but that also it means that you might actually have to take crops out of the ground in late autumn that might still be blooming and giving you harvests to then be able to fit them in your space, unless you have a massive flower farm or a really, really large garden and you have the space to just have like a spare bed waiting. For me, because I have such a small area, I always have something planted, or I just have a small area that's sitting, or the areas are covered in weeds, one of those scenarios. But yes, it might mean that you might have to take out some plants early to then be able to get these cool flowers in autumn. So for example, for me, the dahlias are still blooming and they're looking stunning right now. They have such beautiful blooms in late autumn. So I'm not actually going to be able to take them out. I also like to make sure that they are completely done with flowering so that they can then die back a little bit, and then I can just make sure those tubers in the ground are fully developed so that then once the plant starts dying off, I can lift those tubers and then store them correctly. It's also difficult just to know exactly when or if autumn is really here. I know technically it is, but there is possibilities that we might still have really hot days in like a month or so. So that's also something to keep in mind, whether you might be experiencing a warmer autumn, to just keep that in mind, because some of these plants do definitely need cooler nights. So overall, there's pros and cons to planting in autumn, and if this isn't an option for you, then you can definitely just bypass that and then just plant them in late winter and early spring. And that's also a really great option if you mess up your crop or something happens to your crop. If you're planting cool flowers, there's always the option to then sow them at a later date in the year. When to plant, it really ultimately depends on your first frost date. That is if you do experience frost in your area. If you don't, then you can really plant anytime throughout the winter months and autumn months, just making sure that you have the right seed starting setup so that you're starting seeds at the correct temperature for whatever flower you're growing, and that you select the area that you're planting to make sure that it does have a good amount of sunlight. So in frost-prone areas, you'll really want to have your seedlings in the ground around 4 to 8 weeks before your first frost. And this is just to make sure that those roots are fully developed and you have that nice complex root system so that the plant can then withstand those cool temperatures, because in general, these plants can handle a little bit of frost. They're not going to handle like a really, really harsh freeze, which is then when you can apply a frost cloth and just baby them a little bit throughout those periods when it is really, really cold. But generally, they can handle a light frost if they are established and in the ground, they will be fine. In terms of frost here, we don't really get a lot of it because we are so close to the coast, and honestly the majority of Australia is living on the coast. It's where the majority of our population is, so probably if you are on the coast, you're not likely to get a lot of frost. You may experience some, but generally the further you go inland, the more likely you are to experience those really cold mornings, which is then going to mean that you are going to need to just have some frost cloths or clear plastic over your beds just to make sure that your seedlings are going to be okay. There's also different areas around your property that may be more frost prone. So hot air rises and cold air sinks. So often the low parts of your property are going to be areas where you might see a little bit more frost. Also ones that don't get the morning sunlight. So if you have like a hill on your property and the sun is coming up behind that, you're more likely to get frost on the shaded side of that hill. So you can also use that to determine where you might be able to have your garden beds for these cool flowers, just to make sure that they get as least frost as possible. But if you can't prevent that, then you can always just add extra things like frost cloth over the beds. If you're not too sure about your frost dates, there are some temperature maps and zoning maps in Australia. It's just simple as having a Google and finding one that you can interpret. To be honest, they're not the most in-depth maps compared to like growing regions in the US. They're okay and they give you a general idea, but I think it's just because we really don't have the population to be able to make really in detail and in-depth maps. You can also go on to like the Bureau of Meteorology and some other websites and search for previous information and data sets on frosts and temperatures and get your average temperature for each month. And generally, if you start to see them, starting to get towards like under 5 degrees or so, that might be in a time where you might start to see some frost in your area. But like I stated before, there's always going to be variation in terms of your microclimates. Like the top of the street is going to be completely different to the bottom of the street if you're on a slope. And also just every year, things are going to be different. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at this kind of information. In terms of actually starting the seeds, you can start a lot of these inside in trays, or you can directly sow some of these in the ground. We're going to talk about both of those, and I'll give some ideas of what you can sow for each of the different flowers that we're going to talk about. Some flowers really do prefer to be sown direct, and we'll chat about those later in the episode. But if you're starting them indoors and raising your seedlings, just make sure that you transition them slowly to your outside temperatures as the weather starts to cool down, and start with like having them inside, bringing them out during the day, and then bring them in at night, and then gradually keep them out at night unless you've got like a really, really cold night all of a sudden, until you can then have them both outside and out during the night all night for at least a week or so, just to make sure that they're really hardened off and they can deal with the weather that you're experiencing, and then they'll be fine to actually plant into the ground. And in terms of how to prep your soil for this, I've kind of chatted about this in the previous episode when I talked about things that you can do in autumn in the garden. I chatted in detail about compost in that video because I love compost. So I'm not going to do that in this episode too much, but just do make sure that you do have enough nutrients in your soil for your plants to be sustained for the winter months. And then, like I said, you can always, and I would probably more recommend this, is to focus on topping up that fertilizer and compost or worm castings or whatever you have as a fertilizer, to then apply that in early spring or late winter when you can actually see that the plants are starting to grow more vigorously, because that's when they're actually going to be uptaking a lot of that nutrients. So rather letting that kind of just leach away in the soil, if you apply it all at the start when you're planting the plants, maybe leave some of that nutrients for later in the season. Otherwise, if you are in an area that is very wet throughout winter, you might actually start to see that a lot of those nutrients are just leaching away, and then the plant isn't able to uptake all of that gorgeous compost that you've made when it actually starts to grow a little bit more. For what I'm doing in my flower farm, I am trying to make as much compost as I can. I'm going to apply that to the beds now. I've been applying horse manure as well, and I'm going to be letting that sit over the next few months while I'm growing and starting a lot of my cool flowers inside, so that then it is a little bit more broken down and incorporated into my soil a little bit more when I can actually then plant them in the ground. And then that's all I'll do when I plant them. And then I will probably apply like pelletized chicken manure when I can start to see the plants growing a little bit more as they start to take off in late winter and early spring. That's kind of my go-to fertilizer. It's all organic and the plants seem to respond really well to that. So yeah, that's probably all I will focus on. Maybe add a little bit of blood and bone and worm castings in terms of like diluting it in water and applying that with a watering can to my plants, also to make sure that they have enough nutrients when they start to grow a lot more. All right, now we're going to move on to introducing some of the most popular varieties of cool flowers and some information about each of them. I haven't tried, obviously, to grow all the cool flowers. I don't really have the space for that, but I am going to be reflecting on the ones that I grew last year and the year before and trying to give as much commentary as I can on each of them and any information that I have discovered myself that may help you out if you are growing some of these plants. So number one in terms of cool flowers, and one that I think is a must have if you are starting a cut flower farm or you just enjoy flowers or you have a cottage garden, any of those, is to plant some feverfew. If there's one flower, and if there's only one flower that you can grow or to start your flower farm off, it is definitely feverfew. And even if you had rows and rows of feverfew and that's all you could grow, you would still be making money from this plant. It's really sought after with florists, wedding designers. You can even just sell bunches of feverfew, and that has sold really well for me at markets. Or you can then add them into your bouquets and add them as a filler. The flower is like a spray style flower, so it's got multiple little flowers on each of the stems that kind of sprays out, and it looks like little white daisies with yellow centers. That's generally the one that is the most common, which is the single bloomed feverfew. There are some other varieties out there, but I really enjoy the classic look of the single feverfew. It just looks beautiful. It looks very, very cute, and everyone loves it. I personally started these from seed about 2 years ago, and I really didn't have a lot of success with starting them from seed. Actually, they were quite difficult for me to start. I planted a whole tray and I probably ended up with about 5 plants or so, which was really disappointing, and I'm still trying to figure out how to actually grow them from seed. So if you do have any tips, please do let me know. But what I've been doing with feverfew is actually just taking cuttings from the plants that I already have in the ground. And this is what I would recommend. I would recommend once you have a plant or a few established plants that you just take cuttings from them. Don't start them from seed again, because the seeds are really small and just finicky in my personal opinion. You might have a very different experience, but you can just start them from cuttings. And I have a little bit of information about this on my YouTube channel, or you can just Google how to take cuttings from feverfew, and it is really, really simple. And I use them all the time. I really enjoy using them as a filler in bouquets. And what that does, it just fills up the bouquet like the name, but it then just allows me to poke all of the other stems through and move stems around, and then actually have a bit more structure to my bouquets. Having that filler in the center, or even to then support flowers around the sides of the bouquet, just makes it so much easier to make and design a bouquet so that all the flowers can be standing nicely and be able to see them all really well. My second favorite cool flower is definitely statice. I always will grow statice, and I think, again, if you can only really grow 2 flowers, I would grow feverfew and statice. And if you want to start a flower farm, just get those in the ground and just plant a few rows of each. You'll be set, honestly. It is a very money-making flower in terms of my experience. It is beautiful and really easy to harvest. You get just really nice straight stems that have a very crepe papery texture with the flowers. And I like to add these around the outside of bouquets to really support all of the flowers, and they just provide the best pop of color. I will also just use mixes of them. Like, my favorite mix is to just get some purple, white and apricot and put them in a bunch, maybe about like 10, 12 stems. I usually sell these for $15 at the markets, and they always sell out. Like, people just love these, and I think it's because they look like a fairy bouquet. They're very fairy-like when you put all of those colors together. And then if they don't sell, which usually they do, but if I have any left over, I end up just hanging them upside down to dry. And then I use them as dried flowers. I sell $5 mini status bunches all the time at markets that always sell, or I sell larger bunches, or I use them to add to my Christmas decorations. They're a flower that you can really use all year round because they are probably my favorite dried flower because they hold their color so well. So I really like to start these in a tray. I will just sprinkle in some of these seeds into like a few drills into a tray, and then I'll plant them out when they are big enough. They're definitely not a very tall flower, and they have very flat leaves, the actual plant, that honestly looks a little bit like a weed for most of their life, but then they start to have these stems pop up in the middle of the plant that are the flowers, and then once you start to get those and you harvest the first few, the plant just is so productive. They're really great if you have a dry climate or if you have more of like a drought throughout winter. They're a great option for that. And technically they're a perennial, so they will come back year after year. But I do find that they flower the best in their first year, and they kind of then die off a little bit when it gets really hot and they just take up a bit too much space for me. Not that they're a really big plant, but I can't have things that aren't too productive throughout summer if I can replace those with a more productive plant. So I usually just grow these as an annual, and that's how I have the best success with these. They also really prefer to be harvested regularly, so make sure you keep on top of harvesting these. And yeah, overall, they're just some of the most economical flowers to grow. I think when the seed packets, they're only about like $2 or so. You'll definitely be reaping the rewards if you plant status now, and you can start to get a good harvest of that. Even in like late winter, they'll start flowering. Yeah, they're definitely one of my favorite plants ever for a cut flower farm. The next ones are larkspur and delphinium. Technically, they're different plants. Well, they are different plants, but they are very similar and close relatives. But delphinium is a perennial species and larkspur is generally grown as an annual. These come in like a rainbow of colors, and my favorite is the blues and the deep purples, as well as the lilac. They are a spike flower, which means they're a tall trumpet-like flower, which kind of tapers off at the end. And they can also be dried. So again, they've got multiple purposes. If you can't sell all of the stems when they are fresh, you can dry them, and they do look really nice in Christmas ornaments and decorations. And yeah, you can also press these and they look beautiful as well. I think this is one that you can technically plant all throughout winter because they are very cold tolerant. And some people recommend to sow one round of these in autumn and then again in late winter. And then after that, you can succession sow every few weeks just to make sure that you have a good succession of these flowers. And these can be sown direct or started in trays. I know a lot of people have success directly sowing these in the ground. I think they do really readily like self-seed, so just keep an eye on that. One thing though you will definitely need to keep in mind with these flowers, and to be honest, like a lot of flowers in general, always just make sure you do your homework, that the seedlings of these can be particularly poisonous if ingested. So keep well away from any kids that you have around, or cats or dogs or any other animals that might be either like grazing around the area that you've planted these. Just really keep an eye on this because yeah, if they do self-seed in the grass and you've got like livestock around, you just want to make sure that they're not ingesting this, because they are very poisonous, particularly when they are at their seedling stage. And just in general, a lot of flowers are poisonous. I don't have a lot of disclaimers when I'm selling flowers, but I do tend to stay away from like foxgloves and some of the other quite poisonous ones if ingested. A lot of the ones I do try and grow are edible, but a lot of these cool flowers, just keep in mind if you have children around that tend to, I don't know if your kids end up going for the flowers or not, but just, yeah, keep it in mind that some of these can be toxic to humans and animals. Just wanted to put that out there. But coming back to larkspur, the germination of these can be a little bit tricky because they do need something called cold stratification, where they need a period of cold temperatures for that seed to be able to trigger like coming out of dormancy. So if you are finding that germination is a little bit tricky, you can pop them in the freezer or the fridge for a week or two before you plant them, and then see how you go with that. Last year I planted a little bit too much larkspur, so I'm going to limit that this year because I only ended up using like 2 or 3 of these in a bouquet. You really don't need that much, and they just provide that spike in a bouquet that really draws your eye and creates a bit more height to the bouquet. So yeah, I don't need a lot of them, and I'll just be planting like half a bed of these this year. Another one is cornflowers. These are also known as bachelor's button. This is another favorite that I like to plant, or to be honest, I just let them self-seed in the garden, because once you grow them and let them go to seed, you'll probably have them next year. But these are edible, and they provide that pop of blue color that so many people want. I don't know, blue does really well in terms of flower colors. And they're like a medium to small sized flower that looks very fluffy, and I really, really like them, but I really, really don't like harvesting them. And probably most flower farmers will be on board with this, that they are pretty difficult to just keep on top of. You really need to harvest them consistently to keep the blooms going and have the plant not go to seed. The best advice is to just keep picking and like hack the plant down if you need, and let it regrow. It really doesn't mind a harsh trim, just to keep those blooms coming and keep the plant signaling to itself to keep flowering rather than going to seed. And they can just be a little bit messy as well. So keep that in mind. But yeah, I really do like them. The plants can get a little bit large though, so yeah, they just require a little bit of consistent harvesting, but are definitely worth it because I like to add them to my rainbow bouquets. So I definitely got this idea from Serena from You Can't Eat the Grass, who was doing rainbow ranunculus bouquets. I always grow rainbow colors of ranunculus, but one color that I don't necessarily have unless I have blue anemones is the blue color, and this is where cornflowers are really great, because adding those with a rainbow of all of the other colors and then getting some greenery from the garden, I have every color of the rainbow and it just looks so beautiful. So that's why I grow these, and I usually only grow, I try to limit it to like 5 plants maximum. That's the plan for this year at least. Next is Sweet William. I've had really good success with this year, and it's actually a biennial, so I don't even know if I'm going to replant this. I have one bed of this and it adds great structure to a bouquet. The flowers, they're like a cluster flower, I suppose. I don't know how to describe it. It kind of looks like a small brain, but really pretty. Or more like a coral of flowers. I don't know. My description of that's not really good, but just have a Google if you don't know what Sweet William looks like. And it is flowered really well. Even now I'm still getting a few blooms, and I planted Herald of Spring mix and the Summertime mix. So yeah, Sweet William is another one. I started this from seed inside and then planted them out. Moving on to snapdragons, this is one of my favorite focal flowers that start blooming in early spring and all the way into early summer when the caterpillars arrive. There's a few varieties that are important when selecting for cut flowers with snapdragons, because not all of them are grown for cut flowers. A lot of them, and most of them on sites like the Seed Collection, which is where I get a lot of my flower seeds from, aren't the cut flower varieties. So the ones that I tend to stick to are the Costa varieties. I really love these. They send up like one really strong straight stem, and then they do branch out a bit, but you can grow them really, really close together and get those really nice sturdy stems. I like the apricot and lavender colors. They're my favorites. And this year I'd also like to try the Madam Butterfly variety. Those snapdragons have a little bit more of a frilly and a brighter color to them. I always start these indoors because I want to make sure that I'm actually getting good germination with snapdragons. These are probably the smallest seeds that you'll start as cool flowers. They are teeny tiny, and the way I start these is just sprinkle them on some soil. I don't cover them at all. I just mist the surface with some water until I can start to see germination, and then wait till they have their true leaves forming. Then I will prick them out of the seed starting tray and pot them up into their own pots to then plant into the ground. They're definitely a little bit fiddly, these ones, but they are some of the most beautiful, and I always love growing snapdragons. They smell delightful. I love the smell of snapdragons. They smell like bubble gum. They're so beautiful and not too strong as well. So yes, definitely get your snapdragons started now, as well as my other favorite focal flower, and that is stock. And I think apart from like some of the spring bulbs, this is probably my favorite early spring focal flower. I generally stick to the giant column Pacific varieties, and you can get these at the seed collection. They're really affordable, the seed packets. So yeah, they're really economical if you're starting out. I like to grow Pacific Pink and Miracle Blue are probably my two favorite varieties of that stock flower. And you can either grow these as, you'll hear people talk about whether a stock flower is a single or a double flower. And the difference is really just how the petals look. Some of the stock flower stem is really full and fluffy and pretty large. Those are the double stocks. And then you can sometimes get some seeds that just have a bit of a different genetic variation, which are single flowers, which just have kind of single petals for each of the little flowers on the stem of the stock flower. Hopefully that makes sense. But you can technically try and find out what your plant is going to be when the seed germinates. You can tell by their cotyledons, their first leaves that grow after germination. And if one of them has one large seed leaf or first leaf that comes out that looks really fused together, rather than two of them that look a little bit more normal, if it's fused, they're most likely to be singles. And if they have the two healthy cotyledons that pop out, then they're most likely a double. This isn't always 100%, so like don't take my word for it if you try this out and it doesn't work, but that's what I found from my research and from my own experience. I think for some other varieties of stock, you can also tell what the flower head is going to look like when some of the seedlings are lighter in color, like lighter green. Sometimes those are more likely to be double flowers. But honestly, if you're just confused by this, don't worry, just plant them all and you'll get some beautiful blooms, because stock, whether they're single or double blooms, they're beautiful. They also just smell divine. They have a little bit more of like a spiced scent, but still very sweet. And I'm always getting a lot of compliments when I have these at the markets, because you can really smell them and people just love the smell of stock. I'm going to be sowing all of these and starting these in trays, and you can plant them pretty close together in the ground, and that will like support the stems. Like snapdragons, they will branch out once you harvest the middle stem, but I find it's best just to harvest the one single stem in the middle. It's going to be the largest and strongest, and plant them really close together so that you can get more plants in that area, rather than relying on all of the branches that do come off and the smaller flower stems that you may get. I would just plant them close together and focus more on succession sowing these so that you can just get more flowers of these, because that's what I didn't really do last year. I planted them all at once and then I had so many, I had to figure out where to sell them. Thankfully they did sell and they sold really well, but this year I just want more. I want more stock, so I'm going to be succession sowing these. Another beautiful flower is scabiosa or pincushion flowers. These are really easy to start from seed because the seed isn't too small, and it also looks really great in a cottage garden if you have one of those. I personally didn't have too much luck with these as some of my stems weren't too strong this year. It could have just been me planting them at the wrong time. I don't know. They were just a little bit hard to grow for me, so I wasn't a real big fan. I think if I plant these again this year, I will plant them just in my cottage garden. But I did really enjoy the colours. I had some burgundy and lavender blue, and they were so beautiful. But I just found that they didn't last too long in the bouquets. The petals would just fall off. They'd be the first ones to go, and yeah, they looked really beautiful as a little fill of flower and a pop of colour, but not my favourite, but other people love them. Next is straw flowers or everlasting daisies and paper daisies. They're all pretty similar. Paper daisies are a little bit smaller in size. I tend to stick to the straw flowers or the everlasting daisies, and these again are probably one of the most economical flowers to grow in terms of financial gain that you will be able to get from straw flowers. It's again ones that they last really long in water alongside statice, so you can do just like full bouquets of straw flowers and make them a day or two ahead of when you need to sell them. They'll still look amazing, and then if they don't sell, you can just dry them. I'll also be uploading some of these onto my website soon as like sensory kits and sensory flowers. I had a lot of these in my decorations, my Christmas baubles that I filled these fillable baubles with them. They sold really well. So yeah, overall they were probably one of my most profitable flowers. So I would definitely recommend starting some straw flowers. One thing you want to keep in mind though is I would buy seed packets for these every year. The germination rate of these dramatically decreases year after year. So I found like I have some old seed packets of these that I tried to start. I didn't get any of them germinate. So make sure you just have some fresh seed packets of everlasting daisies when you're starting these. They're pretty easy to start. I do prefer to start these inside, so then I can just make sure that I have good germination of these and that something else hasn't happened outside. And then I do just prick them out and pop them into their own little individual pots before I plant them in my flower farm. Right, we've only got a few to go. The next one is calendula. This is not technically one that I love using as a cut flower. Sometimes I will add it in jam jar arrangements, and that looks really nice, mainly because the stems aren't really that long or that strong, but they do have a special place in my heart. I really do love calendula. They are really easy to start from seed, and I always have these in my cottage garden because the pollinators absolutely adore them. And I also do dry them and use them in like bath salts, and also making my own beauty products from them too. And lastly, one I'm going to talk about briefly. This is not really in the cool flowers category, but I did want to mention that if you don't have frost coming up soon, to get some more sunflowers in the ground. I wouldn't recommend growing these like over winter unless you are in a really warm area that has a lot of good sunlight. But sunflowers, they can actually handle a little bit of frost, granted that the plant is at like a good stage. So if you can, I really like to push sunflowers a little bit later because they can handle a little bit of cold temperature. So don't be afraid to, this goes for other plants as well, just do a little bit of experimenting, see how late in the season you can grow your flowers and your favorite flowers, because you might find that you might have a bit more of a warmer autumn in your area. And there's really not that much to lose. If you do try and plant them now, you might get an extra harvest and be able to enjoy your favorite flowers a little bit more of the year. Just keep in mind with these flowers to make sure that they do just have the correct amount of sunlight hours and that you are planting them in a nice sunny position as the sun starts to drop in the sky. When plants don't have the correct amount of sunlight, they can't actually photosynthesize properly, which means that they just go dormant and they don't have the strength and the stamina to keep up with the really cold temperatures if they aren't a cool flower that can handle frost. So just for things like sunflowers, just keep that in mind, and just do a bit of research on your own climate to make sure that it is still okay to keep getting them in the ground. So those are the ones that I have had experience growing. I wanted to just mention just a few other ones that I'm not going to talk too much about them. I'll just list them individually because I would like to grow some of these, but yeah, I don't have experience growing these cool flowers. Other ones that I haven't grown yet that you can also start now are bells of Ireland, breadseed poppies, forget-me-nots, cress I know is quite a popular one, honeywort or cerinthe, Canterbury bells, and nigella are some other ideas if you are looking for any more flowers. There's a popular one that I don't grow in my garden, and that is Queen Anne's lace or Amimagus. I don't really tend to grow any of the wild carrot flowers. I like to steer clear of these just because they are an environmental weed, and I would really highly recommend looking into whether you might be growing environmental weeds as cut flowers, because I know a lot of people do. And to be honest, it makes me really upset, not gonna lie. I think we really do have a responsibility as farmers and growers to be growing the correct plants, and just because someone somewhere else on this planet and the other side of the globe is growing something that grows beautifully over there doesn't mean we should grow it here. So I would highly recommend to look up the species that you might be growing and just double check whether they are anything near an environmental weed in your area. And please just be careful about growing these, and particularly letting these go to seed. If there's anything that you're ever not sure about, just have a look online and do some research, because while a lot of these plants are environmental weeds right now, they're not technically like weeds of national significance. Garden escapees are a real big problem in nature. And when I was working the bush regeneration job, there was so much garden species in the bush and in the forests that are just not meant to be there, and that can cause serious problems for our native ecosystems. So please just do some research and just make sure that you're not growing anything that is an environmental weed in your area. Some of these that I've mentioned, they might be in your area, so don't grow them. You can choose something else. There's luckily so many different flowers to grow, and yeah, just do your own research and be responsible in your gardens. So that is about it for cool flowers, and everything that you needed to know about cool flowers that I have been doing lots of research for this episode and trying to pull it all into one place for you to listen to. One thing I didn't really cover on here is where you can buy seeds. There's so many different sites, and again, stick to local if you can. Otherwise, one of my favorites, I really enjoy the Seed Collection. I also like veggie and flower garden seeds. They have some really great varieties of cut flowers on there. Or you can start to go with more wholesale stores, like I buy a lot from High Sun Express. You do just need to purchase more large quantities of flowers from here, but they tend to have a really good variety of cut flowers. So yeah, maybe look into that. Or you can start to look into, if you're a cut flower farmer, you can start to look into just buying your seedlings and not even having to worry about seed starting, which one day I might do. I'm not there yet, definitely. And I do love growing from seed and just being able to tell people that everything was grown from seed. I know exactly how it's grown, what it was grown in. But yeah, you can also start to purchase your seedlings as well. Another thing I didn't really touch on was all of the spring bulbs that I am planting right now. And in April, I'll talk about that a little bit more, because that's probably when I'm going to be starting those and getting them in the ground. For now, I'm just keeping them in a box, and they are still just, sitting in a nice storage box waiting, just because I think the humidity is still a little bit high where we are right now. But this might be completely different to you, and it might be a good time to start to get like your ranunculus and bulbs in the ground. So again, just have a look at your own climate to determine this. So thank you so much for listening to this episode, whether this is on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or on YouTube. I've hopefully linked them all up now. It took a little bit of time to figure out the technology behind that, but they should be good to go now. I really, truly appreciate you for listening to this episode and being here. And if you did, make sure to rate the podcast, whatever you feel is the correct rating for you. 5 stars would be obviously amazing, but you don't have to do that. And any feedback, I would love to hear your feedback on this. You can send me a message on Instagram or leave a comment on YouTube. Let me know any other topics that you would like to discuss. And yeah, like always, I'm going to go finish my cup of tea. I've been sipping on a peppermint tea throughout this episode, and I'm going to go and raid my seed stash to actually go and start some of these seeds, because it is time to get them in the ground, and I need to go and do that now. If you would like to support me, you can head over to my YouTube channel and subscribe over there. I also have a Patreon called The Nature Patch, where I share extra content, basically just about my life and extra things that happen. Or you can buy me a coffee. I will leave the information of that over on the YouTube video in the description box as well. So thank you so much for being here today. I hope you're having a lovely day wherever you are in the world. And until my next one, happy gardening, everyone.